On March 14, 1849, in what officials called an unfortunate accident caused by an overturned lamp, the county courthouse in Loon County, Alabama, burned to the ground. But investigators found something among the ashes that didn't match the official story. In the basement, 3 sets of human remains were chained to iron rings embedded in the stone walls. Completely destroyed were the county clerk's records from 1847 to 1849, along with property deeds, marriage certificates, and, most crucially, the probate documents for the Sutton estate. For over a century, descendants of Loon County families have whispered about what really happened during those 2 years at Bell River Plantation, about the twin daughters of Colonel Nathaniel Sutton, and about the slave named Marcus, who somehow documented everything before he vanished. What you're about to hear has been pieced together from surviving letters, from mobile medical records, and from testimonies given to a Northern Abolitionist society, testimonies that were sealed until 1963. Before we continue with the story of the Sutton sisters and the secrets that consumed an entire community, make sure you're subscribed to Liturgy of Fear and that you hit the notification bell. We uncover the darkest corners of American history, the ones textbooks won't touch. Leave a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. We love knowing where our audience discovers these forgotten horrors. The truth about Bell River Plantation begins not with the fire, but with a funeral 2 years earlier, and with 2 women taught that survival meant absolute control. In 1847, Loons County stretched across some of the richest cotton-growing soil in Alabama, black earth that made men wealthy and carved the landscape into kingdoms of white-columned houses, surrounded by fields that reached the horizon. At the center of it all sat the county seat of Hanville, a collection of brick buildings and dirt streets where planters conducted business and their wives pretended not to know the true source of the family wealth. 8 miles south of town lay Bell River Plantation, accessible only by a private road that wound through stands of water oak and across 2 tributaries of the Alabama River. Colonel Nathaniel Sutton had built the main house in 1828, a 3-story structure with 12 rooms and a separate kitchen building connected by a covered walkway. A quarter-mile behind the main house sat the slave quarters, 24 cabins arranged in 2 precise rows, close enough to be summoned quickly, but far enough that the colonel didn't have to hear the sounds of the lives he owned. The colonel had made his fortune in cotton, but his reputation came from something else entirely. He'd served under Andrew Jackson in the Creek War and brought back from that conflict a belief that humans could be improved through careful breeding, the same way one improved livestock. His library contained medical texts from Philadelphia, agricultural journals from Virginia, and personal correspondence with men at universities who shared his convictions about racial hierarchies and biological destiny. Meticulous records he kept, measurements, observations, genealogies traced back 3 generations. His neighbors called him eccentric but brilliant. His slaves called him something else entirely, though never where white ears could hear. The colonel never married. Instead, in 1824, he'd purchased from a Charleston trader a slave woman named Ruth, described in the bill of sale as of uncommonly fair complexion and genteel bearing. In 1825, Ruth gave birth to twin daughters, Sarah and Catherine. The colonel raised them in the main house, educated them with tutors from Mobile, dressed them in fine clothes ordered from New Orleans, but he never freed them. He never acknowledged them as his daughters in any legal document. On paper, they remained his property, an arrangement that gave him absolute authority over every aspect of their existence. In a peculiar isolation, Sarah and Catherine grew up. They learned to read and write, to paint watercolors and play the pianoforte. They studied literature and mathematics, geography and French. But they rarely left the plantation grounds. The colonel controlled who visited and when, screening every potential social contact through his own rigid criteria. He told them they were special, that advantages had been given to them which elevated them above their station, but that the world beyond Bell River would never understand or accept them. He taught them that safety came from seclusion, that trust was a weakness, and that power, however limited, was the only currency that mattered. These lessons the twins learned too well. They developed their own language of glances and gestures, finishing each other's sentences, sometimes falling silent for days and communicating only through notes passed across the dinner table. Identical dresses they wore in coordinating colors, Sarah in deep green, Catherine in midnight blue. They read the same books at the same pace, one starting at the front, one at the back, meeting in the middle. They shared everything, hairbrushes, jewelry, secrets, and eventually, something darker. Their mother, Ruth, died in 1839, officially from pneumonia, though the slave quarters whispered about bruises on her arms and fear in her eyes during her final weeks. After her death, the Colonel's control over his daughters tightened like a noose. He installed locks on their bedroom doors that could only be opened from the outside. He required them to submit weekly written reports on their activities, their thoughts, their dreams. He began testing them, leaving valuables in obvious places to see if they would steal, introducing them to male visitors to observe their reactions, creating situations designed to reveal any hidden rebellions. Through these years, the plantation itself prospered. By 1847, the Colonel owned 63 enslaved people whose labor produced 142 bales of cotton annually. He sold his crop through factors in Mobile and invested the profits in more land, more slaves, more books for his ever-growing library. The slave population at Belle River had an unusual demographic profile, a disproportionate number of light-skinned individuals, more children than the birth rate should have produced, and a disturbing pattern of families separated and sold away just as children reached adolescence. The overseer, a man named Jonas Pritchett, had worked at Belle River for 15 years. He lived in a cottage near the slave quarters and carried out the Colonel's orders with mechanical precision. Pritchett kept his own records, punishment logs, work assignments, dietary restrictions for slaves the Colonel had designated for his breeding program. Written in Pritchett's cramped handwriting, these notebooks documented atrocities with the casual tone of farming reports, which women were forced into which cabins, which children were sired by which men, which pregnancies were terminated, and by what methods. In the main house, Sarah and Catherine understood more than their father realized. They read his journals when he traveled to Mobile on business. They listened at doors and gathered fragments of conversations between Pritchett and the Colonel. They knew what happened in the quarters after dark. They knew which of the slaves were their half-siblings. They knew that their father viewed human beings as experimental subjects in his personal laboratory of racial theory. And they learned to hate him with a cold, patient fury that would have terrified him if he'd recognized it. The morning of February 3, 1847, arrived with unseasonable warmth, temperatures climbing into the low 60s even before noon. Colonel Sutton had spent the previous evening in his study, working by lamplight on correspondence with a professor at the Medical College of South Carolina. Nothing unusual was noticed by the household staff when he failed to appear for breakfast. He often worked through the night and slept late. It was Pritchett who found him at 10, slumped in his leather chair with papers scattered across his desk. The Colonel's face had a grayish tinge, and when Pritchett touched his hand to wake him, the skin felt cold and waxy. 2 hours later, Dr. Amos Grayfield arrived from Hanville and pronounced Colonel Nathaniel Sutton dead, estimating the time of death as sometime between midnight and dawn. Hard seizure, Dr. Grayfield declared, barely glancing at the body. Man was 56 years old, worked himself to exhaustion. I'd warned him about his choleric temperament and excessive mental strain. The heart gives out. Simple as that. But with this tidy diagnosis, several details didn't align. On a side table sat the Colonel's dinner tray, brought to the study at 8 the previous evening, the food barely touched. A cup of coffee, long since gone cold, showed a peculiar residue at the bottom, a fine sediment that glittered faintly in the lamplight. The Colonel's final letter, addressed to his attorney in Mobile, remained unfinished mid-sentence. I have made certain arrangements regarding the future of my daughters which must be executed precisely as stipulated for their own protection and for the preservation of my life's work. Should any person attempt to, the sentence ended there, the pen trailing off the page as if his hand had suddenly lost strength. Wearing matching black mourning dresses that they'd somehow procured despite having no prior knowledge of his death, Sarah and Catherine stood together in the hallway outside their father's study. Their faces showed no tears, no evidence of shock or grief. They held hands, fingers interlaced, and watched the proceedings with identical expressions of watchful calm. More thoroughly, we should examine him, suggested Mr. Harold Breenidge, a neighboring planter who'd arrived to pay his respects. Nathaniel was in good health last month when I saw him at the courthouse. This seems rather sudden. Irritated at having his professional judgment questioned, Dr. Grayfield snapped, the Colonel worked himself into the grave. I've seen it 100 times. The body simply gives out. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to speak with the daughters about funeral arrangements." But that conversation Dr. Grayfield never got. First, Sarah addressed him, her voice perfectly modulated and cold as January rain. "Dr. Grayfield, we appreciate your prompt attendance. The funeral will be held 3 days hence with burial in the family plot. Mr. Jeremiah Osgood, our father's attorney from Mobile, has been summoned and should arrive by tomorrow evening. Until such time as the will is read and the estate settled, Catherine and I will manage the plantation affairs. Pritchett will continue as overseer under our direct supervision." Glances were exchanged by the men in the room. Women didn't manage plantations. Certainly not unmarried women barely 22 years old. And there was something else, something they couldn't quite articulate. A sense that Sarah and Catherine had been waiting for this moment, that they'd rehearsed these words and knew exactly how events would unfold. "Now, Miss Sarah," Mr. Breenidge began in the patronizing tone men reserved for women discussing matters beyond their comprehension, "you can't seriously expect to. Specifically for this eventuality, our father educated us," Catherine interrupted, her voice a mirror of her sister's. "We understand crop rotation, market factors, the management of field labor. We've studied his methods for years. At its current level of productivity, this plantation will continue to operate." What the men didn't know, couldn't know, was that for months, Sarah and Catherine had prepared for this day. They'd studied their father's account books, memorized the names and capabilities of every enslaved person on the property, learned which merchants in Handville could be manipulated and which needed to be avoided. They'd planned for every contingency except one, the specific contents of their father's will. On February 6, under gray skies that threatened rain but never delivered, the funeral took place. 43 neighbors and business associates attended, gathering in the parlor where the colonel's body lay in a walnut casket lined with white satin. A eulogy was delivered by the Reverend Samuel Yates from Handville's Presbyterian Church that praised the colonel's contributions to Alabama's agricultural prosperity and his devotion to advancing scientific knowledge. Not one enslaved person from Belle River attended the service, though they gathered in the quarters that evening for their own ceremony, a mixture of Christian hymns and older traditions, singing songs that celebrated liberation and the settling of accounts. They kept their voices low, but the sound carried across the fields to where Sarah and Catherine sat on the main house veranda. "They think they're free now," Sarah said softly. "They'll learn differently," Catherine replied. The evening after the funeral, Jeremiah Osgood arrived from Mobile, a portly man of 50 with silver hair and the careful manner of someone accustomed to delivering bad news to people who could afford to make his life difficult. He carried a leather satchel containing Colonel Sutton's will and several sealed documents marked for the twins' eyes only. In the colonel's study, now thoroughly cleaned of any evidence of his final hours, the reading took place. Together on a settee, Sarah and Catherine sat, their black morning dresses rustling slightly as they adjusted their positions. By the door, Pritchett stood, uninvited but tolerated, his weathered face expressionless. Osgood opened his satchel and withdrew a thick document bound with black ribbon. Colonel Sutton revised his will on December 12, 1846, less than 2 months before his death. The provisions are unconventional. The document's opening paragraphs were standard, charitable bequests to the Presbyterian Church, personal items distributed to various acquaintances. Then Osgood reached the section concerning the plantation and its inhabitants. "To my daughters Sarah and Catherine Sutton, I leave the entirety of Belle River Plantation, including all lands, structures, livestock, equipment, and human property, to be held jointly and equally between them. However, conditional upon the following stipulations, which must be satisfied within 24 months of my death, is this bequest." Osgood paused, cleared his throat uncomfortably, and continued. "First, both daughters must enter into lawful Christian marriage with men of suitable character and standing approved by the executor of this estate. Second, both marriages must produce legitimate offspring within the stipulated time frame. Third, the daughters must maintain the plantation at current levels of productivity and demonstrate sound management of its resources." Sarah's hand tightened on Catherine's, their knuckles going white. "Should these conditions not be met," Osgood read, his voice dropping lower, "Belle River Plantation and all its assets shall be sold at public auction, with proceeds distributed equally among the following charitable institutions." The list included agricultural colleges, medical societies, and organizations dedicated to the advancement of scientific understanding of human populations. It was the Colonel's final attempt to ensure his ideology outlived him. "There's more," Osgood said, withdrawing a second document. "A private letter to you both." He handed the sealed envelope to Sarah, who broke the wax seal with her thumbnail. Inside, their father's handwriting covered 3 pages of heavy cotton paper. Catherine leaned close, and they read together in silence. The letter explained the Colonel's reasoning with chilling clarity. He'd observed their unnatural attachment to each other, their rejection of normal feminine interests in courtship and marriage. He'd concluded that they would never voluntarily separate, never form appropriate alliances with men who could continue his work and properly manage his estate. So, he'd created a situation where they had no choice. Marry and procreate or lose everything. But the letter's final paragraph contained something more disturbing. "I have made arrangements to ensure you choose wisely. My network of correspondence extends throughout the state and beyond. They will be watching, reporting back on your conduct and your choices. Remember always that you are what I made you, and you cannot escape the fundamental truth of your nature, no matter how you might pretend otherwise. The blood that flows through your veins is both your privilege and your prison." Carefully, Sarah folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. When she looked up at Osgood, her expression betrayed nothing. "We understand the terms. Who serves as executor?" "I do, along with Mr. Breenidge as co-executor. We're charged with approving any marriage proposals and ensuring the conditions are met." 24 months, Catherine said. "That gives us until February 1849. "Correct. I must say, ladies, your father's provisions are highly irregular. Most attorneys would have counseled against." "Entirely his own was our father's mind," Sarah interrupted. "We'll comply with his wishes. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have plantation business to attend to." After Osgood left, promising to return in 6 months to assess their progress, the twins remained in the study. They sat in their father's chair, Catherine on the seat, Sarah perched on the armrest, and looked at the walls lined with journals and medical texts, at the ledgers documenting 2 decades of human experimentation disguised as agricultural management. "We can't find suitable husbands in 24 months, Catherine said finally. He knew that. He designed this to fail. "Not if we control every variable," Sarah replied. "That much, Father taught us. He believed humans could be bred like livestock, that every aspect of reproduction could be managed and directed. We'll prove him right, just not the way he intended." "What are you suggesting?" Sarah stood and moved to their father's desk, pulling open the bottom drawer where he'd kept his most private records. She withdrew a leather-bound journal and flipped it open to a page marked with a silk ribbon. "Father's breeding logs." He documented everything, which combinations produced which results, which bloodlines he considered superior, which individuals he designated for his program. Catherine joined her, reading over her shoulder. The entries were clinical, dehumanizing, describing people as if they were cattle. Purchased male approximately 25 years from Williamson Estate. Good teeth, strong back, quick to learn tasks. Letters visible on back indicate prior ownership in Virginia. Paired with female number 4. Results: 1 male child sold 1837. 1 female child retained for future breeding. He was a monster, Catherine whispered. He was, Sarah agreed. But he was also thorough. And somewhere in these records is the solution to our problem. Over the following weeks, Sarah and Catherine absorbed themselves in their father's documentation. They discovered the full scope of his obsessions, journals spanning 20 years, detailed genealogies, physical measurements, observations on temperament and capability. He treated Bell River as a laboratory, its enslaved population as experimental subjects, all in service of his theories about racial hierarchies and human improvement. But within that documentation, they found something unexpected, evidence of intelligence, resilience, and resistance among the very people their father had tried to reduce to data points. Slaves who taught themselves to read despite prohibitions. Women who'd used herbs and folk knowledge to control their own fertility, quietly subverting the Colonel's breeding program. Men who'd sabotaged equipment and slowed productivity in ways that appeared accidental. Their father had noted these deficiencies without recognizing them as acts of rebellion. One name appeared repeatedly in the later journals, always with annotations of frustration: Ruth, their mother. The colonel had purchased her expecting a compliant bearer of children for his experiments. Instead, he'd found a woman who resisted him in subtle, persistent ways, teaching her daughters to read when he was away, whispering to them about the life she'd known before slavery, planting seeds of doubt about his absolute authority. She tried to protect us, Catherine said, tracing her finger over their mother's name in the ledger. Even when she couldn't save herself. Then we owe her more than survival, Sarah replied. We owe her victory. But victory required resources, time, and one more element they didn't yet possess, a man they could control completely, whose presence would satisfy the letter of their father's will while violating its spirit entirely. In late April, though they didn't recognize it immediately, the solution arrived. The spring auction in Haynesville drew sellers and buyers from across central Alabama, transforming the courthouse square into a marketplace of human misery. On a raised platform, enslaved people stood while white men examined them like livestock, checking teeth and muscle tone, asking invasive questions about work history and health. The air smelled of dust and sweat and fear. With Pritchett, Sarah, and Catherine attended, ostensibly to purchase additional field hands for the expanded acreage they planned to cultivate. They wore black veils, still in mourning, which gave them anonymity in the crowd and allowed them to observe without being observed too closely. Predictably, the morning sales proceeded. Field workers going to plantation owners, domestic slaves to town families, children torn from parents and sold to different buyers. Then, shortly before noon, something unusual appeared on the auction block. Next lot, the auctioneer called. Property of the Granville estate, recently deceased. One male, age approximately 28, name of Marcus. Got his letters, can figure. Worked as a house servant and tutor to the Granville children. No history of rebellion, no attempts to run. Starting bid, $1,000. On the platform, Marcus stood with straight posture and level gaze, neither defiant nor submissive. He wore clean but worn clothing, and his hands, the hands of someone who worked with ledgers rather than cotton, showed no calluses. His skin was several shades lighter than most of the people sold that morning, suggesting mixed ancestry. But what caught Sarah's attention was something else entirely, the way he scanned the crowd, not with the defeated resignation she expected, but with calculation, as if he was evaluating potential buyers just as they evaluated him. Educated slaves are a risk, someone in the crowd called out. Gets ideas above his station. Perfect for a household that needs bookkeeping done, the auctioneer countered. How many of you can balance your own accounts? Here's a man who can do it for you. Now, do I hear 1,000? Slowly, the bidding opened. Most planters didn't want an educated male slave, too much potential for trouble, for reading abolitionist newspapers, for forging travel passes. But a few town merchants showed interest, seeing value in someone who could manage their stores or handle correspondence. Sarah leaned close to Pritchett. Bid. Miss Sarah, we don't. Bid. Pritchett raised his hand. 1,000. 1,200, countered a merchant from Montgomery. 13, Pritchett called. The bidding climbed to 1,600 before the Montgomery merchant dropped out, shaking his head at the inflated price for a single male slave, educated or not. More than market value, Sarah had paid, a fact that would fuel gossip in the weeks ahead. 3 days later, Marcus was delivered to Bell River, walking the 8 miles from Hanville with his few possessions in a cloth bag. Pritchett met him at the plantation entrance and led him directly to the main house where Sarah and Catherine waited in the study. You can read and write, Sarah said. It wasn't a question. Yes, ma'am. Marcus's voice was educated, careful, revealing nothing of what he might be thinking. You tutored the Granville children. What did you teach them? Reading, writing, arithmetic, some geography and history, whatever their father requested. Slowly, Catherine circled him, appraising. The Granvilles were known abolitionists. Quakers, I believe. They allowed their slaves to be educated. For the first time, something flickered in Marcus' eyes, weariness perhaps, or recognition that this conversation was more complicated than it appeared. Mr. Granville believed all people possessed souls and minds worthy of development, ma'am. And you? Sarah asked. What do you believe? I believe I'm standing in front of two women who paid too much for me and who clearly have something specific in mind beyond field labor. Glances were exchanged by the twins. Their father had taught them to view enslaved people as objects, incapable of analysis or autonomous thought. Within 30 seconds, Marcus had just demonstrated both. An unusual situation we have, Sarah said carefully. Our father died recently, leaving conditions on our inheritance that require creative solutions. We need someone educated, discreet, and capable of understanding complex arrangements. What kind of arrangements? The kind that must remain private within this household, Catherine replied. You'll live in the main house, not the quarters. You'll have access to our father's library. You'll be treated well, fed properly, given freedoms that would be extraordinary elsewhere. But in exchange, you'll do exactly what we say when we say it, without question or hesitation. For a long moment, Marcus was silent. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet. And if I refuse these unnamed terms? Then you'll be sold south, Sarah said flatly. To cotton plantations in Mississippi, where educated slaves are worked to death in the fields to break them of any intellectual pretensions. Within a week, I can have you on a boat. It wasn't an empty threat, and Marcus clearly knew it. What do you want from me? That depends, Catherine said. Can you keep secrets? Even ones that could be used as weapons. My entire life, I've had to keep secrets to survive, ma'am. Sarah walked to the window, looking out across the plantation grounds. Our father's will requires us to marry within 24 months or lose everything. But we have no intention of submitting to marriages arranged by men who view us as property to be managed. So, we're going to subvert the terms while technically fulfilling them. I don't understand. You will, Catherine said. But first, we need to know if you can be trusted completely and absolutely. Over the following days, Sarah and Catherine tested Marcus in ways both subtle and overt. They gave him access to their father's library and watched what he read. They asked his opinions on political matters and listened for hints of abolitionist sympathies. They observed how he interacted with the other enslaved people at Bell River, whether he attempted to organize or agitate. Remarkably adaptable, Marcus proved. He kept to himself, spoke carefully, and demonstrated an intelligence that had clearly been honed through years of navigating dangerous social terrain. He understood that educated slaves existed in a precarious position, valuable enough to be kept, dangerous enough to be feared. What the twins couldn't know yet, was that Marcus had his own secrets and his own agenda. The Granvilles had indeed been Quakers with abolitionist leanings. More than that, they'd been part of an informal network that collected testimony from enslaved people about the realities of plantation life. For 5 years, Marcus had documented atrocities, recording names and dates and details in a coded shorthand he'd developed. When the Granvilles died, both within a week of each other from fever, their relatives had sold off the estate, including Marcus, before anyone could discover the trunk hidden in the root cellar containing years of carefully preserved evidence. His most important notebooks Marcus had managed to retrieve before the sale, hiding them in a hollowed-out Bible that no white person bothered to inspect. He'd been bought and brought to Bell River, expecting another period of careful observation and documentation. Instead, he found himself at the center of something far stranger and potentially more dangerous. By mid-May, the arrangement had clarified. Marcus would serve as the twins' private secretary, managing household accounts and correspondence. But more than that, he would be their confidant in a scheme they hadn't yet fully explained. One evening in early June, after the house slaves had retired to their quarters and the three of them were alone in the study, Sarah revealed their plan. Our father's will requires us to marry and bear children within 24 months, she began. The executors must approve our choice of husbands, men of suitable character and standing. But the will says nothing about the husbands being suitable for us, only that they meet external criteria. I'm not following, Marcus said. Catherine smiled. And there was something almost feral in it. We're going to marry men we can control completely. Elderly men or sickly ones or men desperate enough for the connection to a wealthy plantation that they'll agree to any terms. Men who will give us legal legitimacy without interference in how we run Bell River. And the children? Marcus asked, though he was beginning to understand. Biology is biology, Sarah said bluntly. Our father spent 20 years proving that lineage can be strategically managed. The executors need to see marriages and pregnancies. They don't need to see what happens behind closed doors. Like cold water, the full implications hit Marcus. They wanted him to father their children, to create the appearance of legitimate heirs while the twins maintained control through marriages that existed only on paper. You're asking me to commit an act that could get all of us killed, he said slowly. If anyone discovered. No one will discover, Catherine interrupted. We control this household completely. The marriages will be arranged carefully. We'll manage every detail, every possible witness, every piece of evidence. You'll be protected. Protected? Marcus laughed bitterly. I'm a slave. There's no protection for me. If this fails, you'll be ruined socially, perhaps sent away somewhere. I'll be hanged or burned alive. Which is why you'll be motivated to ensure it doesn't fail, Sarah said. And in exchange, you'll receive something worth the risk. What could possibly be worth that risk? Freedom, Catherine said quietly. Documented legal freedom and enough money to go north and start a new life. We'll wait until after the children are born and the estate is secure. Then we'll manumit you, provide funds, and send you away with a cover story that holds up to scrutiny. Between them, Marcus looked, searching for deception or false promises. You won't refuse, Sarah said with certainty. Because you want freedom more than you fear death, and you're smart enough to recognize this as your only real chance. She was right, and he knew it. But there was something else at play, something the twins hadn't considered. Marcus saw in their scheme not just a path to personal freedom, but an opportunity to document and expose the entire system. If he could gather evidence about the Sutton family's secrets, about the Colonel's experiments, about the network of planters and overseers who'd collaborated in decades of atrocities, he could send that information north and strike a blow against the institution that had stolen his life. I'll do it, he said finally. On one condition. You're not in a position to make conditions, Catherine said. I am. If you want my cooperation rather than my resentful compliance, I want to know everything. Your father's journals, his correspondence, his breeding logs, all of it. If I'm risking my life for this scheme, I deserve to understand the full context. This the twins considered. Giving Marcus unrestricted access to their father's papers was dangerous, but refusing might create exactly the resentful compliance he'd mentioned. Agreed, Sarah said. But you'll study them here in this room under our supervision. Nothing leaves this house. Acceptable. What none of them said aloud was that they'd each just made a bargain with someone they didn't fully trust, gambling their futures on a deception so audacious it could only succeed if every element aligned perfectly. And in Loon County, Alabama in 1847, perfection was in very short supply.